Good evening, Sarah. We'd like to recount our monumental 1972 vacation trip that we took. Most of us had never been out of the state of Minnesota, or maybe just to Wisconsin or Iowa. And in June of 1972, my wife and I and our 4 children, your dad, who was then 12, and our daughter Amy was the youngest, she was 3. We decided to take a trip to California to visit my older brother Larry. And we embarked on a 17-day odyssey that covered 5,700 miles. First day was, go ahead.
It sounded good, but you ought to have been there.
First day was uneventful. We just drove from our home in Roseville, Minnesota, which was a suburb of St. Paul. We drove to, I think, North Platte, Nebraska, if I'm not mistaken. A lot of highway time. The next day we drove from North Platte, Nebraska to Rawlins, Wyoming. And Rawlins was an unusual community. You had the interstate here and a bluff there and not much in between. And I stopped at the grocery store there and got some provisions, including milk. And the next morning we were giving our children milk with their cereal, and they said the milk tastes funny.
Well, they said the cereal tastes funny. We said, shut up, hurry out and eat. We've got to go. We're wasting time here. Eat it. And then I took some. Oh, it was so sour and rotten, and we just bought it. And the poor kids, I was making them eat it. I felt like the world's worst mother.
So we left Rawlins and drove to Salt Lake City, Utah, which was a short day for us. But then we spent a lot of time in Salt Lake City. We toured the Mormon facilities. We saw the Mormon tabernacle, where if you drop a pin here, you can hear it completely around the facility. The acoustics were so good. And then we went on a major wading expedition in Salt Lake, Great Salt Lake, and that was fun. We came out with big clusters of salt on our legs, and we could cut. Go ahead.
The kids found these little red, they look like shrimp. They were teeny tiny. And we later learned they were a brine shrimp, red things. Of course, Joel and Kevin, or Kurt, one of our kids, found them right away and were playing with them. But yeah, the salt on our bodies, ooh, it was just white and caked. They let you rinse off afterward. Okay.
On the 4th day, we left Salt Lake City and we drove across the salt flats. And I remember Kurt waking up and looking out and seeing how desolate it was. Nothing there. It was a long, long day. We drove, I think, over 600 miles and wound up at South Lake Tahoe, California. And we had time in the afternoon to visit Lake Tahoe. Beautiful, beautiful lake.
Which I was barefoot, of course, and the sand was so hot it burned your feet. You couldn't walk on it. Pardon me. But the water was so cold you couldn't put your feet in. We would see who could hold it in the longest, and nobody could. It was just ice, but beautiful and clear. It was a beautiful place. Yeah.
We stayed in South Lake Tahoe, California that night, and we were looking for a place to eat, and we saw all these motorcyclists and rough-looking people, and I was apprehensive. I thought, oh, this is going to be a good evening, but we found an International House of Pancakes, and we had a wonderful dinner, and we went back to our motel and went to sleep. The next day was a long, long day. We drove from Tahoe, California, through Yellowstone Park, where we saw everything there was to see in the park. Giant redwoods, waterfalls.
Yellowstone or Yosemite?
You're right, Yosemite. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm here.
Yellowstone is different. Okay, Yosemite.
Yosemite.
I wrote Yellowstone. Yosemite Park.
It was, yeah.
And finished up that day by driving to my brother's home, which I think was in San Jose, California. They moved a lot, so I'm not sure which location this was, but.
In that park, though, I saw bluebirds that I'd never seen so blue. Huge things. And there were guys sitting there on the ground smoking pot. And I just almost had a heart attack back then. And ribbon falls or bridal falls, little waterfall strings that came out of the mountains. In the El Capitan or whatever, this big...
Largest exposed face of granite in the world.
There was a lot to see there, but we rode on a special tram to see the giant sequoias. And we made the kids pose inside one, and they were all looking so strange, they said they were scared to be in there. It was, later they told us, it was just huge. The trees, you couldn't believe it. That was fun, though, doing that. And I picked up a pine cone from one of them. I thought, I'm going to take that home. And the guide took it out of my hand and threw it down. You can't take anything from the parks. So I didn't. Anyhow.
So we arrived at my brother's home in, we'll say San Jose in the evening. And those people don't do much planning, and they're very disoriented. When we got there, our niece, what's her name?
Laura. She's a year older than Amy was, so she was 4. They both were born in May. She came out with 2 dresses on. One arm through one over the side and one arm through another over the side and hanging on her. Her room upstairs looked like it had been ransacked and dug out and turned over and just destroyed. And his brother Larry was working on putting a floor in the bathroom that he hadn't finished before we came, and we were to sleep on a rollaway bed, and he got us sheets and we put them on, and there's a tear from one end to the other, and I just, oh, that's okay, it'll be like we're at home. But of course at home we never had torn sheets. It was amazing, but it was very late, and Amy hadn't got much sleep. She had started out being real nice and holding hands, but after a while she became just insane with overtired and crabby and wouldn't let us hold her hands, and we could hardly contain her. But she was supposed to sleep upstairs with sweet Laura. And before we even got to bed, I think it was then the neighbors called and asked Larry, do you know where your daughter is? Yeah, she's upstairs in bed asleep. No, she's in our house. So he had to go over there and drag her home and put her to bed. And then she told Amy, say cock-a-doodle-doo. And Amy did it. Say it louder. And Amy did. And then she said, Daddy, I can't sleep. Amy keeps saying cock-a-doodle-doo and I fall out of my bed. And we were all a little, she wasn't, oh my, we were sort of shocked. But nobody got sleep at that house. No one. Mm-hmm.
So on day 6, since we had a late night the day before, I don't think we did much that day, but I remember Larry taking us on a tour of the countryside and showing us some of the farms. Gilroy, Los Baños, I think Gilroy was known as the artichoke capital of the world. And I believe that night the adults went out alone to eat, and we went to a strip bar, and I remember, disgusting.
I had forgotten that. It was hideous. Oh, crude. Just, and one woman comes out bent over, leading with her rear end that was nearly naked, and Larry said, what a strange entrance. It was, and the icky guys there, and I thought, why me? I don't want to be here. Gross.
So the next day, day 7 of our trip, Larry took us to Carmel by the sea, and we had a beautiful, beautiful day. We recall sitting on the beach near the water and eating grapes, and the girls had sand in the grapes and were eating sandy grapes.
And all over their bodies. And we got sourdough bread that we pulled apart with some cheeses and stuff.
And we saw seals and whatever.
Beautiful beach.
Wonderful day. Then we came home and it was late, and we had a plethora of pork chops that my brother broiled.
Dinner at 11, mind you, to this 3-year-old who hadn't slept for God knows how long. Oh, my goodness.
Oh, during our stay there, the boys slept outside. They had a patio area in back, and the boys slept outside under the stars. Didn't have beds for them.
And as we traveled with the kids, we had brought 3 pillows for them, which they tend to sit on in the car. and one apparently had some severe odor. They called it the poop pillow. And guess who got stuck with that all the time? Gary, the youngest, the littlest, had to sleep on the poop pillow. Yeah, that was horrible.
The next day then we toured San Francisco, and that was a delight. We had hoped to ride a cable car, but we must have been there at midday, and all the locals were on it. We just impossible to.
Well, I wasn't going to jump on a moving car with people hanging out the edges and through the windows and dangling. I thought, my Lord, nobody can fit that. No wonder it was free. You couldn't get on it. No.
But we spent time down by the water, and we probably had a nice lunch, and we visited an arboretum in a park, and that was a nice day.
Yeah, there was a mime along the piers, you know, the shore. Kind of like in Seattle, they have piers, and that was cute to watch. He really did a good job with it. And I guess you had to give him money. That's why they do it. But that was fun.
Then the next day, day 9, we drove to Anaheim. And I remember it was very uneventful that day, but I do recall that we stopped to eat lunch under an overhead bridge because it was the only shade. Oh, let me add that our 1965 Pontiac Bonneville didn't have air conditioning.
Oh, God. And the Mojave was in our way back.
Well, we'll get to that.
No air conditioning.
On day 10,
no water.
On day 10, we spent the whole day in Disneyland, and we had a motel that had a wonderful swimming pool. It was the first time I had ever experienced a heated swimming pool. You jump in them, you don't even know you're in water. It was quite an experience.
But the last ride, it wasn't a ride. It was like a tree house in Disneyland, and we climbed up with it, and Amy wouldn't cooperate, and she was a brat crying and yelling, and people look, you know, what you like, shut your kid up. Well, how? Give me a break. And she didn't want to look in the windows of the treehouse. She didn't want to be there. He could hardly hold her. She was having such fits. So that sort of took the wind out of our sails, and we went back to the motel and tried to get her to sleep. I think she slept.
So the next day we drove from Anaheim to San Diego to see the San Diego Zoo. And it is quite a zoo. There's so many different animals, and there's more plants there than there are animals, and extremely rare things. And
yeah, we rode a tram through it again to take a look because it's so big. And there was a little baby with the parents in the front seat before us, and the baby would, you know how babies plat. And Amy goes back, like the kid was fighting. The baby didn't mean anything by it, but she's fighting with the baby. I thought, oh my God, what are we going to do with her the rest of the time?
She was getting pretty cross.
Holy hell.
Yeah.
Okay.
On the 12th day, we got up, I think before we went to bed, and we drove across the Mojave Desert. Without air conditioning, and back then people didn't carry water with them, so we had no water and no air conditioning, and we stopped at a place, Kingman, Arizona, I suspect, and we're going to have a hamburger and a drink, and Gary gulged water, and
we all guzzled water.
Came right back up and made you sick to your stomach. So.
And he's sitting there puking in the restaurant, and I got to feel a little sick to my stomach, and then I remembered all these old cowboy movies. Take it easy, not so much water at first. I see why. It made you sick. We couldn't finish our food, yet we were starving. But he's there, all over. How embarrassing, running with him to the bathroom while he's... Oh, good grief.
We continued on then and spent the night at Grand Canyon National Park. There was a tourist place, cabins. Nice place. We enjoyed it. I mean, plain but nice. And the next day we drove through Grand Canyon National Park. And I remember getting next to the precipice and wanting to hold Amy's hand. And by now she was so out of it that she didn't want to hold our hands, and we had this...
She ran toward the edge of the cliff. No hands, just like, oh my God, she's going to go over. She's going to die right now, the only girl. And we run after her, and she wouldn't hold... She crunched down with her hands hidden so we couldn't hold her hands. And Grandpa finally had to take her in the car while she screamed in her fits and tantrums. All that from lack of sleep.
And we left the park then. I think we stayed in Flagstaff that night, but I'm not sure, and it's probably not all that important. But the next day, we left wherever we had been staying, and we visited a place called Four Corners National Monument. It's the only spot in the United States where 4 states meet at a common corner. It's Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico, I think.
Where people were lined up to take pictures standing there. Of course, we put a kid in each state and took a picture. And there was a line waiting to stand there and take a picture. Well,
when we left Four Corners, we drove through this Mesa Verde Park, which is in the southeastern corner of Colorado.
Oh, that was beautiful.
It was deserted now, but it had been occupied by Indian populations in years past.
Maybe
and there were
20,000 years ago.
There were caves in the sandstone, and then they had a hole in the ground that they called a kiva that you crawled down on a ladder. And that was just for the men only. I think they built it to get away from the women. And,
but they were tiny cliff houses. They must have been small people. And they lived on the cliffs to protect themselves from enemies, I guess. It was so interesting.
And as we left Mesa Verde, they had a forest fire, brush fire, and I think if we had been a day later with our trip, we wouldn't have been able to visit Mesa Verde. But we got out of
They had
there.
to close it down.
I think we stayed that night in Alamosa, Colorado, but it's not terribly important where we stayed. Next day was just highway from Alamosa or wherever to Hot Springs, South Dakota.
You can imagine we wanted to get home.
Hot Springs,
Oh my
South
God.
Dakota has a
So
huge
long.
indoor swimming pool that is fed by hot springs. And we had a delightful stay there, a small community, but it was nice to stop and have that experience. Next day was day 16. We toured the Black Hills, the Badlands, and Wall Drug. There's a town named Wall, and they have this drugstore that's famous. In fact, they have many, many stores in the town.
Cowboy-like old
Tourist
town.
trap. And when we visited the Badlands, the sun was just right. They were just beautiful. And we heard another fellow tourist there saying, "These are bad lands."
Like, oh God, give me a break. But the sun shone off of them, and these pinks and colors, it was beautiful. I had seen it before, but never in that light. That was nice. But the very last day...
Well, let's...
Excuse me?
Touring the Black Hills, and we went to Mount Rushmore, which we had done before with our boys, but Amy wasn't around at that time, so we revisited Mount Rushmore, which was a delight. And if you've ever seen the movie North by Northwest with Cary Grant, it's a very good movie. They end the movie at Mount Rushmore. And that night, then, we stayed in Kadoka, South Dakota, and it was the worst flophouse, family-managed hotel you could ever imagine. Oh, let me back up a little bit. In planning this, we didn't have credit cards then, except I had a gasoline credit card. So I had written to all of these people, except with a few exceptions. I had written to all the hotels, motels, and sent them a check. And these people hadn't cashed the check because they probably thought, who the hell would be dumb enough to stay here?
Well, we did.
But we got up early in the morning and we left them.
We had bed to bed on the one room. There was no room to walk. We had to crowd everybody in there, and it said air conditioning. It was not enough to cool a closet. It didn't cool the room. It was hot. And I went to brush my teeth. The water was so hideous with sulfur and stuff. I gagged. I could not even brush my teeth with it. And I want to go home. I don't want to do this anymore. I felt like kicking like Amy. By that time, 4 kids. I swear that's when my back got bad, turning around, hitting at him, because all they did was fight. He's looking at me, he's touching me. All day long with the 4 of them pick on each other. Pick, pick, pick all the time. It was great. You know your dad. He picked. I think they even put boogers on that pillow that they made Gary sleep on. God. Okay.
And on day 17, it was fairly uneventful. We stopped in Mitchell, South Dakota, and I remember it was so hot that my tennis shoes stuck in the asphalt
The street
pavement.
was melting. We sunk in the street.
And we again stopped under a
100,
overhead bridge. That
yeah,
snapped.
102 or 3. The wind, hot, like you put your head in the oven. Yeah.
And then fairly uneventful until we got close to home, and we were coming down a hill in a curve, and you could see our house up ahead, and Amy said, "Oh, our greenhouse."
It was blue.
But
she didn't think she would ever see home again. And she was so thrilled to see her very own house. I thought she was too young to put through that. All those days
and
in
we
the
were
car.
and we were too old.
Yeah, well, we aged 20 years on that trip.
But it was a memorable, and we took pictures. We had 3 slide trays.
Yeah. Well, he planned it so well. We saw everything on that trip. All the parks, all the things to see out west. I think that does it. But I wouldn't recommend a trip like that to anyone with a brain.